Welcome to a short lecture on task analysis, learning about what people really do. I'm a software engineer. I've been involved professionally in software engineering since pretty much 1982, even earlier because I started as an undergrad. I've been writing code, people have paid me money, we've gotten great things done. One common thread that I've had through my whole professional career is that I've had to learn what people want my software to do. I've had to learn what people really do in their jobs. I've had to learn how people implement process. I've had to negotiate contracts with other companies that do things different. I've had to organize things in different cultures which have different laws and different methods. And I've really had to spend a lot of time asking the question, what do you really do? And it's interesting because there's a common phrase that I hear all the time in the English language. And you walk up to someone and you give them your hand and you shake their hand and you say, how do you do? How do you do something? And we say, how do you do all the time? Well, how do you do has become sort of almost like tattooed on me as part of what is software engineering. And task analysis is an approach I've learned over the years, honed a little bit here and there, but I've learned that there's really nice systematic ways where we can learn what people really do. And this will help us do the right thing for the right people at the right time on the right project at the right budget. Well, so let me share with you some of my ideas on learning about what people really do. I have a teeny bit of background. I guess it's necessary. You might not know who I am. I'm Robert Sabourin. Some people call me a software evangelist. I don't know if I'm an evangelist. I certainly talk about software engineering and software testing and getting things done in software projects a lot. I run a small consultancy called amibug.com. We operate in the Montreal area, although our customers are around the world, literally around the world. The last couple of years, I've had paid work in about 4 continents, and I keep going and doing all sorts of things in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in North and South America, and in Australia and New Zealand and all over the Galactic Empire. So I go to where the customers are. My work is divided into 3 elements. Part of it is training, part of it is consulting, and part of it is professional development. The professional development stuff is when I work with organizations like, for example, McGill University, to work with undergraduates to help them develop skills and opportunities in software engineering. I work with professional organizations like the Association for Software Testing and other groups around the world to help promote good practices in software engineering and help to convince people that software engineering is a lot about social responsibility. So I'm concerned about that deeply. And today I know of all the people who are watching this, probably all of you know at least one person whose actual life depends on software. And so for me, this is very critical that people develop the right software for the right people, at the right time, in the right place, on the right platform, well, in such a way that it doesn't hurt other people or interfere with other things. So anyhow, that's a little bit about me, my company, amibug.com, and the little book I wrote with my 10-year-old daughter a long time ago called I Am a Bug is an attempt to explain to young children between 3 and 8 years old what mommy and daddy do at work if they're in the software testing or software engineering business. So that's us. The email addresses on the page, or you can use them to contact me. Any questions are welcome. Just let me know where you heard about me or where you saw this presentation. Thank you very much. So When I do task analysis, I analyze a task. Tasks are many things to many people. If you talk to uh, a person walking down the street and you use the word task in a discussion with them, a sort of a casual discussion, people will think it's a burden. A task is a burden. It's something I've been burdened with. I must have it. It's attached to me. I have to do this task. Uh, or if you went and you saw, God forbid, a project manager might say, well, a task is a indivisible unit of work. You know, it's like the atom or the quark in my project management universe. A task is a small indivisible unit of work. If you go to an agile team practicing Scrum, you might ask them about tasks and they'll tell you, well, a task is something we actually do, and a task is like a chunk of work that a developer or a tester will do in the team to implement a story. So a task is part of a story, or a task is part of how we implement a story. And this is, of course, confusing unless you realize that when they say story, they mean requirement. And when they say task, they mean work to fulfill the requirement. And other people have different views of tasks. I like to say that a task is a chunk of work that a human being can do to get some sort of job done, to do something useful, something productive. So if you look at the world of people who do marketing communications, it's one of my favorite fields, marketing communications. And you go in marketing communications field, and one of the jobs they might have is to create a brochure. So the task would be create a brochure. And someone who has the skills to do the task recognizes that and says, aha, I recognize that task. I can do it because I have the skills to create a brochure. And someone else will look at that task and say, I recognize that task. I do not have the skills to do that. I will not do it. So a task, when you see it, you can very often, if you know how to do it and if you have the skills to do it, you can recognize that. So that's an important thing. A task is also a step. It doesn't have to be complete. It doesn't have to be everything. A task could be a step, a chunk of work. So to get something done, you might have a team of people who need to collaborate, and they break a big problem into small problems, and they take the tasks and they do them in a collaborative way. Now, each individual will be doing the tasks, but each task by itself may not have a really fantastic shippable deliverable. But if you take them in aggregate, if you combine all the tasks, then we have something that we can do cohesively. So task analysis is really trying to understand what are the tasks required to get a job done. Now, different companies, different organizations, different teams have different views of what done means. There are people who practice agile software development with Scrum who very, very assertively say that a done thing is a very deliberate checklist and everybody on the team must conform to done. And when a task is done, it is done. And here's a list, and we're very clear and explicit about what it is. Other places might be much more general about what done means, and they'll just say, well, done means we've shown it to the customer and it passed their acceptance criterion, and that's all there is to it. It's done. So sometimes done of a task has to do with the actual work you do in the task. Sometimes done in the task has to do with can people use the results of the task. It doesn't really matter which is which. I encourage my customers to try to be consistent, but it doesn't really matter which is which. So when I do task analysis, I'm trying somehow to learn how a job is done. I am very inspired by the wisdom and excellent writings of David Snowden on the area of task analysis. I don't really think he uses the term task analysis, but he talks about tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is that sort of how can I put it, non-pedagogical knowledge. There's things that people learn through experience that gets sort of transmitted, not because you read a book or took a course, but because you actually engaged in the creation of something. And what David has learned in his work and his research is that one of the greatest ways to share knowledge is storytelling. So he calls storytelling an old skill in a new context. And I'm often, when I'm speaking, I will put up a slide with a picture of a fire. I will put a picture of a campfire on the screen. And then I'll tell a story. And I love that genre, the style of presentation. Well, in organizations, you can actually use storytelling so that one generation of practitioners shares their wisdom and experience and all this tacit knowledge with the next generation. So to quote Stoughton in his book, Storytelling, an Old Skill in a New Context, stories exist in all organizations. Managed and purposeful storytelling provides a powerful mechanism for the disclosure of intellectual or knowledge assets in companies. It can also provide a non-intrusive, organic means of producing sustainable cultural change, conveying brands and values, and transferring complex tacit knowledge. So storytelling is a way of not just sort of bragging about the crazy adventures we've had in our lives. Storytelling is about generationally transmitting things. If you look at work done in researching and trying to write books about the history of people who are the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, you'll see that what they're doing is they're parsing stories that are told from one generation to the next generation to the next generation to the next generation. And it's the telling of the story that's part of the exchange of the information. In fact, I think if you just wrote all the stories in a book, you'd lose a lot of the value of transmitting of the story. And it's not that people put their own spin on it, and I'm not talking about changing the story like the old game of post office when Rob tells Ann and Ann tells Bill and Bill tells Rob, and the story changes every time you tell it. I'm saying that when people tell a story, they will make it real for the next generation. So I will talk about something that I did that maybe you're not going to do, but that I really, really relate to. I'm not going to tell something that my great-grandfather did. So something I did related to the story. And this will help transmit knowledge and help you learn and help you sort of identify the tricks and foibles of what's moving down the pipeline. So task analysis with storytelling is an approach I really love to do. Now, it's not the only approach. There's a whole slew of task analysis approaches, and it's not the only approach I use too. I actually also like to do facilitated group experiments, interviews, and I like to watch people use systems and videotape things and then do analysis afterwards. So it's not the only mechanism, but for me, it's a fantastic, efficient mechanism to get to the point about what matters the most. I've used task analysis to help understand about the products that my customers want me to produce. I've used task analysis to help me understand how teams of people collaborate to get things done, how a team can collaborate better to be more efficient, how teams can collaborate better to be more inclusive, how disparate teams with disparate goals can work together to do something useful without contradiction of the goals. So I've looked at collaboration, cross-company, cross-organization, cross-cultural, and the cross-cultural ones are wild and crazy stories I've got about that. And of course, jobs. How do people do their job? What do they do? Can we take a look at an expert who's a guru at that job and sort of look at how they do it and then identify what are these skills, what is the knowledge, what is the experience required to do that well? So I've used task analysis to understand products, collaboration, and jobs. And in products, I've used task analysis to also understand things like the user experience. The user experience, for example, of a novice user, an expert user, a typical user, a user in different business, technical, organizational, and cultural constraints. So task analysis can really help me understand the interaction between people and systems to get something done. In task analysis, I will elicit requirements. So I will interview people who are customers, users, consumers, business stakeholders, project managers, product owners, and I will interview them about what is the project required to do. And when I interview them, I usually will say, please share with me a story about what you see people doing with that feature, element, product. I want them generally to talk to me about how they imagine the product solving their problem. How does the product deal with their lives, with their tasks, with their activities? And I want to ask them to tell me stories. So I learn about requirements. Eliciting requirements, by the way, is a tricky skill. It takes years, I find, to hone it, because it's not just a sort of a skill of learning how to synthesize something in writing. It's a skill of being able to make people feel comfortable in sharing with you this stuff and not get distracted by details that don't matter. In software engineering projects, you'll see that many users were going to go and walk up to you and start telling you about where the menus and the dialogues and the controls should be on a system. And I really don't want to hear anything about menus, dialogues, and controls. I want to hear about what their job is and what they're trying to do and what it means to be successful at their job. And what are the limits and the constraints? Not the design of the system, but there's a cognitive thing. When you start asking people for requirements, they start telling you about design, and they get further and further away from their actual problem that they have to solve. So I try to get them to talk about the problem. I do task analysis as part of my consulting work a lot to basically understand the business and technical process which is being used to develop or test or do something with software engineering projects. And sometimes this involves collaborating with people doing hardware and software in embedded systems. I've worked in many different domains, many different areas, and helped people identify ways to do things better, maybe identify where we could automate things that are automatable or mechanizable. Maybe we can loosen up the bureaucracy. Sometimes people associate software engineering process with lots of paperwork, and so where can we get rid of bureaucracy? The process elements that I like to look at have to do with basically governance, rules we have to follow. Usually I try to help people find a light, effective process to meet their goals without stifling the creativity of all the people involved in the team. The anchor point when you have multiple teams working on a project seems to me to relate to software testing, which is interesting because I'm very passionate about software testing. So often I look at a project and I'll understand the steps and I'll try to identify points where things get tested or confirmed. And those are points usually where people believe an entity is ready, but they want to confirm it's ready or to establish that it might not be ready. So we have this sort of anchor points where we're doing testing of activities, and we look at why are we doing that testing there, and what are we doing the testing, and how could that interact with other teams. And another area where I do a lot of task analysis is in training and professional development. This is the one I probably do the most in my consulting business, where you basically meet with teams and try to understand how they do jobs and identify what skills are needed to do those jobs, and then figure out ways so that people who are not doing the jobs can develop the skills to do the jobs, and the other way around also, people who are doing the jobs can maybe improve their skills to do different types of jobs. And this involves sometimes whole organizations with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who the management wants to transition from one way of working to another way of working without just getting rid of the people because they don't have the right skills. So task analysis is just fantastic when you're trying to identify how to basically hone in on what skills matter, and then identify ways where you can train people to develop those skills and change how they do things. In task analysis, I like to learn from within. Now, when I say learn from within, I'm always talking about interviewing people who do the job, interviewing people who need the product, interviewing people who develop the software. I don't go to another company 50 miles away that do something different, look at what they do and say, this is how you must do it. Now, you can parachute in process. It's possible. There's nothing actually wrong or illegal or immoral or unethical about parachuting in process. But when I do task analysis, I'm usually saying you have a team, it's cohesive, it exists for good or for bad. People have different skills, different experiences. That's a unique set. And what I want to do is start from that set, learn what people really do, identify what customers really need, and try to figure out, is there some sort of disconnect here? It is very rare that there is a total disconnect. It does happen. It happens especially when there's a huge confusion about things like make versus buy decisions. So they might, a customer might not realize that you can buy a spreadsheet program like PowerPoint that does all this stuff for you. And so they're starting to make requirements. Instead of saying, I would like a spreadsheet program, they make a requirement saying, well, I want to be able to take this cell and add it to this cell. And they get all microscopic about things, and it just really doesn't matter. So sometimes there's a big disconnect. But for the most part, task analysis, by actually talking to real people and learning what they really do, it helps you do things that can influence change, because you can relate to people. You can relate to the things they do. You can relate to the objects they touch. You can relate to the activities that they're used to doing, the vocabulary they use to discuss them, the decisions they make to get things done, the bureaucracies around that. So this is basically where I'm talking about task analysis by learning from within, not task analysis by parachuting in something from outside. So I have to say, though, that both of them are possible, and I have seen many organizations, most notably banks and financial institutions, which they go in there and they literally parachute in a process. And on Monday, they're doing process A, and on Tuesday, they're doing process B, and they've just parachuted the whole thing in. And now we have to do all these documents and things. Of course, many people get totally frazzled by that because you're way, way, way out of your comfort zone. So I prefer baby steps. Start from your familiar and work your way through a jungle of unfamiliar. So learn from within. When I'm doing task analysis, I try to get the delegates whom I'm interviewing, the interviewee, the staff, the employee, whoever I'm interviewing, the customer, the user. I try to get them to share with me examples from recent experience, recent examples. I know that when we're telling stories, sometimes the most important stories are stories that took place a long time ago. In software development, our cycle time for technological evolution is dramatically tight. I would say that if I try to attach myself to any one technology, if my learning curve is longer than about a year, it's probably not worth it for me to do, because next year there's going to be another emerging technology. I walk into conferences and talk about software testing all the time, and people come to me and ask me specific tool questions. Did you use tool A? Can tool B do this? All this. I could talk for hours about tools, but if I was to become expert in all these tools, by the time I'm an expert in the tool would be irrelevant most of the time. So we have tight cycles. If you do choose an example that's not from the recent experience, you've got to be very careful to focus on what's different in the era of the story and today. So, for example, you might take a simple thing like everybody today has a cell phone that they walk around with that they can sort of search something on Google. And then you go back 50 years ago, and there was no notion of Google, and people, when they needed information, had to actually physically go to a library or something like that. And so an example of a method of doing something that took place 50 years ago, which involved taking a big, huge trip to the library every Thursday, well, that maybe that you got to explain a bit of context. You say, hey, wait a sec. We used to go to libraries because we didn't have Google back then. I mean, mind you, I'm a big fan of libraries. Keep going to libraries. There's nothing wrong with libraries. But at the time of your story, the world was different. So you want to make sure people understand that if you have a story that's not recent, explain the factors that were different at the time. So the stories are, if they're recent, they resonate with people. If they're recent, you remember them better. If they're recent, there's a stronger chance that you can find some sort of evidence from them. If they're recent, you can probably find people who benefited from or who didn't benefit from it, that are still around, that are still alive, that are still with us, that are still working with the company, that are still in the same team. So recent stories are the ones I'm usually fishing for. When I'm doing task analysis, I ask people to share recent experiences. I want people to share first person experiences. I use the term first person a lot, and people who study grammar might know what I'm talking about, or people who have learned English and then French try to look at verbs, and they say, well, there's the first person, and there's the second person, and then there's plural, and all this type of stuff. Well, I'm not trying to be your French grammar teacher from grade 3. What I'm trying to do here is say the first person is I. I did this. I did that. I did this. I would like people to share stories that they experienced in and tell the story in the first person. Tell me what I did. Don't tell me what Fred did. Tell me what you did. And if you just take this beautiful little quote here, this is inspired by John Kennedy's inaugural address, which took place on January the 20th, 1961, Washington, D.C. He said, and this is often quoted, he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. So Kennedy is basically setting a stage here. He's setting a stage. He's starting a new presidency. He's basically saying to people, can you be patriotic? Can you make our country great? Can you make the world great? So he's talking about things, and he's basically got this beautiful perspective that he's trying to get people to be patriotic and respectful. And if you read the whole speech, it's just gorgeous in there. Now, I respectfully paraphrase this, and I'm not trying to take the thunder from Kennedy. It's a beautiful speech, but I respectfully paraphrase this. I love the paraphrase. It goes like this. Ask not what your system can do for the user, but ask what the user does with the system. Ask the user what they're doing with the system. Don't ask what the system does for the user. When you ask people to describe things, don't tell them to describe to you the designs, the dials, the steering wheel, the finish, the stuff that are controls, menus, dialogues, controls, buttons, all of this stuff. Instead, ask them to describe their job. Ask them to describe what they do. Now, when I was in the medical software business, I worked on a crazy Death March project in which we were trying to create a new version of a system that literally had hundreds of menus and dialogues and controls with over 200 established users of the customers of the system. This was a huge project, and it was a Death March project because of business commitments and legal obligations. If it wasn't out by a certain date, our company would have all sorts of liabilities, and frankly, it would have just killed the company. Everyone would have been laid off. It would have been a disgusting thing. So I looked at the methodologies that people were using, and the methods of development were all focused on what the product did. They had the old version, they were creating the new version, trying to replicate what the product did. And this wasn't getting anywhere. They couldn't converge it. The development team was having trouble giving the testing team builds that were stable enough to test. Even developers on one desk would have something working. The desk two desks over, you wouldn't run it because the developers doing conflicting things. I personally got off my butt. My role was R&D manager responsible for software engineering. And I went and I knocked on the doors of customers. And I went to many, many customers. And I asked them to describe their jobs. Tell me what you guys do. Describe what you do. Of course, relevant to our system, but describe your job. Describe your tasks. Describe what you do. And tell me stories. And I collected the stories. And after interviewing almost all of the customers, I found out that even though the system had hundreds of menus, hundreds of dialogues, hundreds of controls, dozens of reports, thousands of features, there was only 27 things people did. Only 27 things. So I totally refocused the development and testing effort on these 27, what I called usage scenarios, and we got them going one at a time. I hired people from among the customer base to help us test it, to make sure we had it from a domain perspective and there were no omissions. And we were able to converge the project well in advance of the Death March deadline. And for the first and only time in my professional career, I have to say that I received a cash bonus, which is interesting. The story goes to say that this was the money that I was used to start my company, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to do it. And so I quit my job as a result of this. Ask not what the system can do for the user. Ask what the user does with the system. We're not modeling the software. We're modeling the usage of the software. We're modeling the user's job. I'm fishing also for incidents. When I'm telling a story, we often call these incidents. I like something, as I mentioned before, that's recent. I also would like it to be real and relevant. Those I call the 3 R's. Real, recent, relevant. Real, you're not making this up. It happened to you. Recent, time horizon is such that people can relate to it. People know. People who experienced it are still around to talk about it. We can find artifacts of it. And relevant, the incident is relevant to how you practice things. It's relevant to your purpose. Task analysis is purposeful. I don't ever do task analysis just for the fun of task analysis. I'm doing task analysis to learn something, to help improve something, usually very specific things, not vague things. So I try to make sure that the incident is relevant. So if I was to prepare for a task analysis interview with a user, let's say, a couple of days before my interview, I might talk to the user or send them a note, tell them the type of incidents that I'm hoping they can share with me, and give them a hint as to why. What's the relationship of this incident to my purpose? So they can choose incidents that help advance learning things about whatever I'm there for. If I'm trying to learn about test automation, we may want to have stories that have something about test automation in them. So I want to make sure they're relevant. I call those the 3 R's. So the incidents we select, we try to get ones that people are going to share that were important or influential or both. Now, I don't know how boring your job is, but a lot of people have jobs that are pretty dull. And every day they do a whole bunch of tasks that are rote, silly tasks that you got to do because you got to do it and it's got to be done. And these tasks, if they didn't get done, well, the world would probably not end. You probably just get slapped on the wrist a bit. I want the tasks, or the incidents rather, that made a difference. Something that might have been significant. Something that influenced how you do things today. Something that you learned from. It could be something that confirmed something you already knew, or it could be new methods that came in. So I'm interested in things that influenced change, things that were important. It might not have changed how you do things, but it was particularly important. You know, when we did that payroll last week, it was particularly important because half of the employees were moving to the new headquarters for Amazon in Toronto, or whatever the heck is going on. So we're looking for things sometimes that are important or influential. I have the habit of asking delegates to share with me 3 different experiences. I don't want to just hear one story. I'd like to hear 3 stories. The granularity of the stories, I try to encourage people. I'd like you to share with me relevant stories to whatever the purpose is. Relevant stories which you should feel comfortable telling me out loud in about 15 minutes or less. Sometimes 5 to 10 minutes is more than enough. I do not want a story that would take you 8 weeks to tell, or that requires writing a novel here. So I want to hear just a very specific story. And when I'm interviewing you, I'd love you to share 3 incidents, not just 1, but 3. I'd love to hear a terrible, dismal failure. Tell me a story that had a negative outcome. Tell me a story that didn't work out, that failed. A terrible experience. So that's 1. I want to hear a terrible experience. I also would like to hear a wonderful experience. I want to hear that beautiful story of the experience that you went through, that at the end of the day, life is good, I feel great, I made a difference, the project was better, the boss patted me on the back, everything is going okay. It was a wonderful experience. And the 3rd story that I'd like you to share is just a typical one. Not terrible, not wonderful, but typical. So can you share with me a typical experience? Unfortunately, many times when I interview people, they say the terrible and the typical are the same. I don't argue with people if they want to say that to me. That's fine. I fine. Tell me 2 stories if you want. But usually I love to ask them, and so I prime the pump, right? I check a few days in advance. Hey, can you think up a terrible story, a wonderful story, a typical story, and just, come to see me when you got those 3 ideas ready, and I will take a maximum of 45 minutes of your time, let you share those stories, and it will help us a great deal in our task analysis. So I leave it up to the person whom I'm interviewing to select the stories. And I also do not tell them what I mean by terrible. What do I mean by wonderful? What do I mean by typical? Typical I might define. It's the most common. But terrible and wonderful, I want to know their perspective. Why do they think it's terrible? Why do they think it's wonderful? And it's really cool when you start interviewing a lot of people on a lot of projects, you're going to see the reasons some people have for it to be terrible are the reason other people have for it to be wonderful. So it's really a personal thing. So it's their perspective of why is it terrible, why is it wonderful. So the typical user experience is the most common pattern, something that happens frequently. I do not want you to confuse this with the happy path. I'm saying common. What really happens? If what really happens is that people don't give you all the information, well, then that's the common case. I have a Canadian insurance company that brought me in to help with performance testing problems. It was disgusting. You walked in there, they had finished their system testing, everything went very, very well, but they went into a pilot project and it's failing because of performance problems. It was just slow. It was lethargic. Without a huge load, it was starting to choke. So I looked under the hood a bit. I went in there putting my consulting hat on and my performance testing hat on. And I started looking at what was going on, and I found out that the actual requirements of the system, which they tested against, were put together by business analysts. But the business analysts really were talking about business rules in the insurance industry. They really fleshed it out very well. It was all good. But the users were not consulted. It was the analysts that were consulted. And when you talked about, they had their common use cases written out, the formal specifications, and the way the analysts had set this up was it was a wizard. So you went through step A, filled in the form, then step B, then step C, step D, then you're done, and the transaction is over. Now the problem in the insurance industry is that when an operator gets a request, actually the most common pattern is that the customer does not have the details. Think of yourself, the last time you had to call an insurance company. Did you have your policy number handy? Did you have the name of your broker handy? Did you have the serial number of your car handy? Probably not. You called them and you were in an accident and you needed help. And you called them with incomplete operation, incomplete information. And the operator who talked to you asked you a whole bunch of questions and eventually was able to find all this extra information and help get your transaction done. That is actually the most common pattern in many, many insurance companies. You never have complete information. You have incomplete information. Now, because this major Canadian insurance company assumed that all the information was there, they optimized the pipeline so that it flowed through their step A, B, C. And if there was missing operation, the operator would have to go A, B, oops, I got to go way back, get the information, then A, B, C, oops, got to go back, get the information, then A, B, C, D, got to go back. And all this back and forth thing led the system to become overloaded and lethargic. And it's because they confused what was effectively for them the happy path with the most common pattern. So common pattern, I'm really fishing for what is typical. What do we expect typically to happen? What usually happens? So that's the typical user story. The negative experience, the terrible experience, is problematic. Something did not meet the needs. We introduced somehow new problems. Things were not better, they were worse. Something mucked up. So we look at the negative user experience and we say that this happened. In software engineering, maybe you might say there's a major bug that escaped to production. I don't know how it got there. It shouldn't have got there. We should have caught that earlier. Okay, so that's an interesting story. That's a negative story. A bug escaped to production. So the story is negative in the eyes of the beholder, the person telling the story. I can't go and write you a list of what does negative mean to everybody on the planet. It's just not reasonable to do that. Instead, it's negative because somehow expectations were not met, something mucked up. Things were worse off after than before. Usually you learn a lot from these stories. So I don't collect these stories to criticize people. I collect these stories to learn how sensitive things are to the different elements. I learned to try to understand, wow, what was the root cause of that? Is there any way we can improve that or change that or get different people doing different things at different times to get things done better? Or maybe it's just chaos and we should change our expectations a bit and say, hey, wait a second, once in a while we do get something that escapes production and it's a business risk and we're willing to take that business risk. In either case, the negative user experience is a story that I want the delegate to share where things did not meet their expectations or needs from the perspective of the person I'm interviewing. So that's the negative user experience. And of course, I want the positive user experience. This is where everything went well, everything went swimmingly. We did not have to do any rework. It was in all extents the happy path. Things were great. Things were glorious. We got high praise. We got bonuses. We got customers were happy. People wrote articles about our product. We've got lots of stars on Amazon's website. We have lots of positive reviews on the social media universe. So things went well. So that's a positive user experience. Everything went well, no work required, happy path. That's the positive experience. So I get people to share 3 stories, not just one story, a positive, a negative, and a typical. If you want to learn more about task analysis, you might want to take a look at the book Task Analysis Methods for Instructional Design by Jonathan Tesmer and Hannum. And this is a book that I was introduced to by Dr. Kim Keener in the early 2000s. We held a peer workshop on exploratory testing, and Dr. Keener asked all of the delegates, there's about 20 of us, to read this book and know it before the meeting, and I did. I read the book. I actually mind mapped the whole book, and I was just amazed by it, and I really fell in love with the method that's described in there called the critical instant method for task analysis. But there's a lot of task analysis methods in this book, and it's sort of considered by some to be the Bible of task analysis methods. It's just beautiful, beautiful reference. If you're ever looking for new ways to do task analysis or user experience testing or requirement analysis, this might be a fantastic reference for you. Again, it was written with the intention of instructional design, so that's the training part of it, but it fits into the whole plethora of process modeling, requirements, and instructional design. In task analysis, with the critical instant method, we try to learn from, this is the terminology of the critical instant method, specific, non-routine events that changed or that challenged your expertise. So this is basically learn from specific, non-routine events that challenge a person's expertise. Hard to find, by the way. These are not the perfect stories, but when you get them, you really learn a lot, and you learn it quickly. Focus on what matters. Task analysis with the critical instant method is not a new approach. Indeed, during World War II, task analysis with the critical instant method was used by the United States Air Force to train fighter pilots. At the time, during World War II, there were many, many airplanes in production. There was a lot of regular pilots, but there was a severe shortage of fighter pilots. So they had to figure out, how do I train a regular pilot to become a fighter pilot? So what they did was they basically used task analysis interviews. They interviewed many, many successful fighter pilots, tried to identify, break that down into tasks and skills, and then created training mechanisms so that the regular pilots could become excellent fighter pilots. And certainly a lot of people who study military history would suggest that this application of the critical instant method for task analysis was a game changer in World War II. I leave that to the historians to judge, but I think this is a beautiful, beautiful documented case study on this. It's wonderful stuff. I've seen some of the notes and experiments, and it's a beautiful thing. They really did interview tons and tons of successful fighter pilots to come up with stories, to learn all this stuff, including all this tacit knowledge that they could then share with the next generation of people. So the U.S. Air Force used task analysis with the critical instant method. Here's some examples of lessons learned. Lesson number 1, spinning and aerobatics. Spinning and aerobatics are not permitted. Do not do this. Next lesson, diving. Normally, the propeller may be left under constant speed control, but if the engine is to be throttled back, the propeller must be set to a positive course pitch. You got to imagine that tacit knowledge. Where did they get that from? And then another one here, mislanding. You can imagine you're landing in the wrong place, in the wrong way. Open the throttles fully. If necessary, set high boost control to plus 9 pounds per square inch position. Raise the undercarriage immediately. Don't wait. Don't procrastinate. Do it now. Climb at 120 miles per hour. And above all, after landing, Open your gills. So this is some lessons learned through critical method task analysis during World War II, prior to basically the end of the war, where there was a huge air war in Europe. And this was basically task analysis. Pilots were interviewed who were expert fighter pilots, so they could figure out how to train regular pilots into becoming fighter pilots. When we're doing task analysis, we have an opportunity also to collect real-world data in a sort of a fun way. All the stories that we collect are actually, I think, quite fun. I collect lots of stories, and sometimes I will collect, I don't know, if we just do a little bit of story collection math here, if you have 50 people interviewing 3 stories a person, you have 150 stories. And when you take the stories, I can then parse through the stories and learn things. A few years back, I was involved in an experiment where we interviewed, with task analysis methods, we interviewed people who were self-identified test managers on software projects. And I basically looked at that, and I wanted to identify what were all of the objects, what were all of the actions, what were all of the decisions that people make as part of their job when they're doing software test management. And what's really cool is, from all of this stuff, from 150 stories, there were only 2 or 3 that actually explicitly mentioned referencing a test plan. Now, a test plan prior to, about 5 years ago, was probably one of the most significant documents in a software development project. And yet, of 150 stories, only 2 or so actually explicitly mention this test plan document. And I love that, because that gives me real world data to say that, well, maybe test plans have a value, but it's not a referenced value during the project while things are getting done. People do other things. People reference other documents. People don't use that plan for maybe what managers think they're using this plan for. So I love to look at real world data, what real people really do in the real world. Of course, we're looking for also stories. We're expecting people to tell stories. We hope that people don't exaggerate or lie in these stories. They may accidentally misremember something. So it is important to not just listen to one person, but to collect stories from other people. In the commercial projects, I have worked with many professionals on this, and we're interviewing usually, about 40 people to try to understand a development process for an organization of a couple of thousand people. So the sample space is, if you interview around that, you start getting the stories and not missing some of the key elements of it. When we're doing task analysis, we look at the results, we look at the stories, and we try to identify what are the key elements of getting the job done. What are the key elements of skills? What skills do we need to do the job? And the task. What is it we want to know about the task? How do we know it's over? How do we know it's done? How do we know the person who's going to be doing the task has the skill to do the task? Work breakdown. Task analysis techniques can be and have been and continue to be useful in supporting process improvements. Anytime a team does work together to get something done, you can do task analysis to assess it, to take a look at it, to see if we can do it better. We can use it for needs assessment. Needs assessment, understanding requirements of systems, understanding what customers need implemented in the software that we're going to be developing for them. We can study behavior and try to identify, are there any essential behaviors? Can we isolate the specific behaviors? Can we prioritize the behaviors? Are there ways people behave that lead to success? Are there ways people behave that lead to failure? Are there ways people behave that have nothing to do with the project that are getting in the way of the project? So we can study behaviors, try to isolate them and prioritize them. As I prepare my interview, I keep a few things in mind. First thing, I interview participants one at a time. I've learned not to have 2 or 3 participants being interviewed simultaneously. Overall, my main concern has been that if I ask the question to participant A, participant B might answer. I think participant A might say things so as not to make B and C uncomfortable. I think A might not say things or may say things based on who's in the room. So what I've learned is interview participants one at a time, make them feel very comfortable, make sure they have a nice glass of water, make sure that the room is quiet, we can close the door, we can hear each other clearly. When I'm ready for my interview, I use recording devices, audio recording devices, although also video, depending on the nature of what's going on. But usually I will have 2 audio recorders running simultaneously. The reason that I use 2 is as a backup. It's terrible if you go through an interview and while the interview goes on, your audio suddenly fills up or doesn't work anymore, the battery runs out. So I've learned to always have a backup. Make sure there's fresh batteries in them, of course. Have a backup. While I'm interviewing the person, I will be typing on a computer screen. I create mind maps based on the conversation we have. And I like to make the delegate interviewee feel very comfortable. Let them see my screen if they want. It's up to them. I'm not interpreting the data. I'm just basically recording what is being said to me and putting it in a sort of a structured form in a visualization like a mind map. So interview participants one at a time, not in groups. I've also learned that it's a good idea to have one interviewer and one interviewee. But sometimes you have 2 interviewers and 1 interviewee. Again, that gets a bit awkward too, because the interviewee might limit what they say if there's multiple people in the room. So I want to make the person being interviewed feel as comfortable as they can. When I start the interview, I like to make sure that I learn about the people being interviewed. Now, task analysis does not always allow time for the interviewee to get to know personally the person being interviewed. So what I will generally do is at the beginning of the interview, ask a few questions. And this could be almost following a template. I don't like templates, but this could be following a template. The type of questions I'm going to ask are pretty similar depending on, what the purpose of the interview is, but it's pretty similar from candidate to candidate. So I will ask, what was your job at the time of the incident? So you're telling me a story. At the time of the story, what was your job? And sometimes people will say their job title, and I will ask them to tell me, well, what does that job title do? I want to know what their job was. What were they being paid to do? So I learned that. What was the job at the time of the incident? They may have changed responsibilities since then. I asked them, what was the amount of experience in that job at that time? How long have you been doing that particular job at this company, in this organization over here? Have you been doing that for 2 weeks, 2 years, 10 years? So what's your experience at the job? And then I ask about their experience in the domain. So if someone is working, let's say, in the medical software business, then their job is a test manager. Well, they may have 2 years of test management experience, but have 20 years of medical domain experience. So I want to basically understand their level of experience in the domain. How long have you been working in the domain? Also, I try to learn a little bit about the history of the incident. So I try to learn a little bit about the history of the incident. I want to situate that in the history of the organization or the history of the department. I want to learn a little bit about when the incident occurred. So when in time did it occur? Can we pin down the date, the month, the hour, the year? So when did it occur? We can ask questions about what circumstances led up to the incident, especially if it's an incident that doesn't happen very often. Well, what happened to lead up to this thing? Were there any things precipitating this? Did Indiana Jones remove the icon and therefore the boulder came out of the tunnel? So what circumstances led up to the incident that we're going to hear the story about? How did you learn that you needed to work on the incident? Did you get an email? Did someone give you a phone call? Did someone come and meet you in person? Did you just know? Were you being informed or did you poll? Were you interrupted or did you learn about it by asking? So how were you informed of your need to work on the incident? Was it just a ticket like in a restaurant? A phone call, a message, text message, SMS, email, chat, Slack channel? How did you learn that you had to work on the incident? Was it an actual memo or letter? Court order? Boss said so? Peers said so? How did you learn? I want you also, before diving into the stories of the interview, to try to understand the factors that influenced decisions around the project. So, what business were we in? What technologies were we using? What was the organizational structure? Were there any elements of the culture that were special to this? So, these are things that are called context drivers. Context drivers are factors that influence how people make decisions and prioritize things. This is just a nice example of a mind map of context drivers. If you look at, business contract drivers, well, who were the main stakeholders? What was the market that we were selling into? How were we funded? Legally, how were we organized? Did we have any legal obligations, regulators, service level agreements? What technologies were we using? Were we making our own technology? Were we licensing technology? And how was our organization? Were we doing things in a hierarchical structure, matrix structure? Were we following a prescribed framework for development? Were we using Scrum, a rational unified process, waterfall models? How were we organized? During the interview, I ask the interviewee to tell a story. Share with me your story. Tell me the story of your typical case, your happy case, your sad case, your negative case. I try to use open-ended questioning. An open-ended question is designed to encourage a full and meaningful answer using the subject's own knowledge and feelings and expressing them in their own words. It's the opposite of closed-ended questions, which encourage short, single-word, yes-no type of answers, one of a list of answers. So I try to use open-ended questioning when I'm doing task analysis. I ask the interviewee to describe the incident from their perspective, from their point of view, from their eyes, first person. And this is sometimes hard to do if you're not used to it. What did you do? When you walked into the office, what did you do? You went, you had a coffee, you sat down, you talked to Fred, you answered the phone. What did you do? I want to hear what you did from your perspective. Want to know what you did related to the incident? Were you a major part of the incident? Were you ancillary to the incident? What did you do in the incident? I want to let the interviewee tell the story without interruption. Many people are natural storytellers, but they have to be in their comfort zone to be ready to tell a story. I like to let the interviewee tell the story without interruption. Tell the story. I don't interrupt them. Now, once in a while, when someone's telling a story and they're uncertain about what to say next, there's a pregnant pause, what they call a pregnant pause, a long pause. And I really literally do not like to jump in there and interfere with the story. I like it to continue. But once in a while, I might prompt the person by repeating to them the last little bit they said. Said, oh, wow, what happened after that? To encourage them to continue the story. When someone is telling me a story, I really do not want to give them scripted questions. The next question I ever ask depends on what I've learned so far. The questions in task analysis do not follow a script. Now, they may be like a little template at the very beginning, but as I'm learning the story, I don't have scripted questions. I want to hear the story. As an interviewee is telling the story, I will, from time to time, ask a very special type of questions, but I'm going to limit myself. I'm going to only ask these questions in very, very specific circumstances. For example, now these are called clarifying questions. They clear up things, clarifying questions. So the first type would be definitions. The interviewee speaking, they use a term I'm not familiar with, or they use a word I thought I was familiar with, but I didn't ever hear it used like that. I will pause them and ask them, can you please define this term? Because if I didn't understand the term, I won't understand elements of the story coming up, or maybe I will misunderstand something that was just told to me. Then there's acronyms. In software engineering, every time you talk to someone, there's a whole bunch of new acronyms. It's amazing how many acronyms we have in our vocabulary. Tons and tons and tons and tons of acronyms. Anytime a interviewee uses an acronym that you're not familiar with, and even if you are familiar, you might want to double check, please ask them the clarifying question, can you define that acronym? What does that stand for? And then there's the point where there's an ambiguity, often caused by casual use of language, and this ambiguity could lead to confusion. If I tell you, I took my briefcase to the car, it was brown. What was brown? The car or the briefcase? There is some confusion possible. It's not really the fault of the speaker. It's the ambiguity of the pronoun in English. So whenever there's a confusion, feel free to ask a clarifying questions. The clarifying questions from time to time also help to make the speaker feel just a teeny bit more comfortable because they know you're paying attention and you're not just transcribing what they're saying, you're trying to understand it. So clarifying questions help us understand what the speaker is sharing. When I'm doing task analysis and I'm listening to a story, I have learned to avoid introducing terms or concepts. I do not say things like, if someone is talking to me about a project and they never talk about requirements, I will never use the word requirement. Now, if they say they're doing use cases, I will use the word use cases. But if they don't say a word, I won't use it. If they don't introduce a term, I won't use it. If they don't introduce a concept, I won't use it. I will never in my interview ask about terms or concepts that were not introduced by the speaker. Now, this for me is their story, not my story. When I start introducing terms and concepts, it becomes my story that they try to fit into. They look at it like a model. And I've learned to be very, very careful about introducing terms or concepts. Gaps. After I've heard the story, I thank the person for sharing their story. Wonderful, I have all the information. I took my notes, got my mind map. I try to ask some questions now about the story. Well, first of all, if it hasn't been made clear already, I asked the question, why was the incident categorized the way it was? Why did you think that was a positive incident? Why did you think that was a negative incident? Any special reason for you to consider this a typical incident? So I'm just looking for the why the delegate or the speaker or the interviewee subject classified it that way. You just told me a story. It was a great story. I learned a lot from that story. That's what you did. Before you did it, were there any other alternatives that were considered? What other alternatives were considered but not necessarily implemented? Well, we reformatted the disk. We considered buying a new one, but we found it was much more cost effective to reformat the one we got. Well, we also considered using someone else's disk, but then we thought that would corrupt the data and lead to just a bigger problem. So we reformatted the disk. So what alternatives were explored? Who did you collaborate with in resolving the incident? Now, when I'm taking my notes, will very often tag the roles of people that were mentioned. And so when asking questions about this afterwards, I might say, okay, well, you talked about the project manager, the product owner, the development lead, the build master, the test lead, the scrum master. Were there any other people you had to interact with to get this task done, to get this incident resolved? So I'll just look for fishing for people we collaborated with to resolve the incident. Once I've got that list of people, I might ask about their roles, their responsibilities, the scope of influence. What do they say? This is the old chicken and pig thing related to breakfast. The chicken who laid the egg is involved in the breakfast, but the pig who was turned into the sausage was committed to it. So who's committed and who's just watching? We check how this incident contributed to the project's success or failure. All right, I've got the story. I've got the incident. I know what was told to me. Excellent. How did that make a difference in the project? So we're not now just talking about the incident. We're talking about the relationship between the incident and the project. And I usually say success or failure here. Did that incident have any bearing on the success of the project? Did that incident have any bearing on the failure? And I've seen cases where a very negative story has a very positive influence. So a negative thing, a problem happened, it really screwed something up, but we took corrective measures and it never happened again, so we have a much better quality product. So I want to know the influence of the incident on the project's success or failure. I like to storyboard the experience. This is for me one of the most important parts of understanding the story. So I've got the story, I've got a map of the story, I've been creating the mind map, I've got my notes. What I will do is I will take a bunch of single flip chart sheets, blank flip chart sheets, and I will draw pictures on them. Now, I'm not an artist. I cannot draw pictures, but I'm trying to create something that is very, very similar to an American-style comic book like Batman, Archie, Superman. All of these comic books have multiple frames on a page that tell a story. and each frame incrementally advances the story. And so when I'm storyboarding an experience, I want to basically describe the story in frames where each frame advances the narrative of the story a bit. How much? It's not uniform in time. Usually what I do is I go between places where people make decisions or enter or gather data. So I look at data, decisions, and I go step, 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 step. I will create the storyboard with flip chart sheets on a wall, physically on a wall, and then I'm going to walk through it with the interviewee. And what's really cool is almost always I get it wrong, and so they correct me. And by correcting me, they give me a better view of the story, and we find omissions and improve it. It's a really wonderful way to basically improve your knowledge from the story sharing experience. So storyboard the experience and have the interviewee critique your storyboard. I use, by the way, UML stick figures. I'm not an artist. Simple, simple diagram. Once I've got the storyboard, I like to carefully review with the interviewee the timeline and the sequence of events. So do I have the right order of activities? Do I have the right list of activities? Are there any missing activities, out of order activities, duplicated activities, redundant activities? Did I take the same activity and name it 3 different things? Or, that should be just one thing. So I try to close these gaps. Are there any points where we have gaps in time? Large gaps in time. That's funny. From this frame to that frame, there's like 4 hours missing. What happened to these 4 hours? It's like the Watergate tapes, right? What happened to the time on the tapes? Where did the time go? So if we find large gaps in time, we want to account for them. Now, I'm not suggesting that we want to be critical of this. We just want to account for them. Was there an activity we're missing? Was someone distracted from the activity, moved on to something different? Were we waiting for an external event? Were we in the parking lot? How can the interviewee account for the gaps in time? And they will generally account for them, and that'll tell us more of the story. We'll get a better picture. When I am ready to analyze now, doing my task analysis, I start with decision points. So I want to know, okay, we did this activity. Where did you have to make decisions? And I try to identify where in the storyboard, where did we make key decisions? Who made the decision? Which decision was made? Which factors considered? And when did this happen? When in time and when in sequence did these things take place? So we take a deep look at decisions. What decisions were made? Once we've identified the decision, we might ask the question to the interviewee, here's a point where you made this decision. What would happen if you had made a different decision at that point in time? How would that have influenced the outcome? Can you talk about that a bit? Have you ever had a situation where you made a different decision? What's the influence of that decision? What's the impact of that decision? What's the importance of that decision? Another part of the analysis then is to look at our story and try to identify objects that are created, objects that are referenced, objects that are modified, objects that are deleted, objects that are changed, objects that are reset to a controlled state, objects that are backed up, objects that are restored, objects that are otherwise manipulated by the interviewee in some way, shape, or form to complete the task. What are the objects of this task? What are the objects of the story? Objects are often described in language as nouns. So when I'm looking for objects, I will be parsing what I was told for nouns, the name of a person, place, or thing, right? A noun is a person, place, or thing. If I identify an object, I want to know about that object. And for objects, I'm going to ask about every object that's been mentioned. So I've been seeing this. There's a whole bunch of objects that were mentioned. I'm going to ask about all of the objects that have been mentioned. I'm going to use my judgment here. I'm not, if someone talked about a candy bar wrapper and I'm talking about test analysis, I'm not going to probably look at the candy bar wrapper, but I'm going to look at stuff that's relevant to the story. So when I find that object, I might ask the question, what's the story of the object? Who created the object? I don't know. It's always been there. No. Who created it? When was the first time you saw it? How do we maintain this object? How do we maintain it? From whence does it come? What's its life? How do we maintain it? I like to take a look at the objects that have been discussed and ask if I can have a copy of or an example of that object to help support the user story that I just heard, to help understand better what's going on. So I try to gather examples or samples or exemplars to help me. So I got examples of the objects. Then I go through the story again, but this time I try to identify actions. What actions were done by the interviewee to complete the task? What actions were done? What did you actually do? Actions are described using verbs. A verb is an action word. Actions are described as verbs. The verbs in the narrative, the verbs in the story are the actions. And I will go through the story, through my mind map, and I will highlight, like with a yellow marker, highlight all of the actions. And it's going to be a very good and comprehensive list because that's the things you do. What are the actions? And then I'm going to try to rank the actions by importance. Some actions are trivial, inconsequential, not of importance. Some actions are paramount. And if someone can't do these actions, they can't do this type of activity. So it's very important for me to basically rank the actions by importance. And sometimes you have to ask interview questions about this, taking action A and taking action B, and trying to understand the relative importance for them. Is this more important than that? And of course, there are all sorts of implied actions, implicit actions, actions that are not written down. So these are like implicit requirements. Whenever someone says, I can create something, well, shouldn't they also be able to update it, change it, delete it, save it, restore it? There's all sorts of implicit actions. So when you see an object, you see an object action pair, you might say, are there any missing actions? What about this? What about that? What about the other thing? So we're looking for our understanding of missing actions, applied ones. Look for the missing ones, hunt them down, stick our nose in there. Can we find them? And of course, they're usually hidden around. Maybe they're not part of the story. Maybe they're part of another story. Maybe we need another story. In the end, I want to ask some exploratory questions. I want to ask the delegate, what if circumstances were somehow different? What if something was different? How would the story pan out if something was different? Or do you have an example story that is different? And I might just write it down, cue it up. What other stories should I be asking you about? What other stories should you be telling me about? Is there something you know that I don't know that now that you've told the story, maybe you think I should learn about? These are all things that are exploratory questions. In exploratory questions, what I ask next depends on the results of what I've learned up to date. Not scripted, not prescriptive, exploratory. I'm trying to learn, but I'm trying to learn toward a purpose, toward the purpose of my task analysis. So at the finale, I've heard the story. I've heard the beginning of the story. I've heard the context factors of the story. I ask, what would you do different next time? What would you do different next time? Would you make different decisions? Would you choose different objects? Would you use different actions? Would you interact with different people in different times? Would your order of operations be the same? Would you add steps or remove steps? Would you do the activity at the same time in the project? Maybe earlier, maybe later? Would you maybe get someone else to do the activity? What would you do different next time? And of course, a lot of people, when they're asked a question like this, they feel very constrained. Because when you're asked the question, like, what would you do different next time? You feel, oh, the budget is out of my control. The organization is out of my control. I can't influence that much change. Therefore, I got to keep doing the job the same every time. So I can't do different next time. So if that's the case, and the delegates are sometimes very right to act that way, because they can't do things very differently, so they're not going to have a very good answer to this one. Well, maybe you should consider asking the question, if you had a magic wand, what would you change? All of a sudden now you got this image of Disneyland, right? The magic wand, the magical kingdom. And you'll say, well, no, you could change anything. Here's $1 million extra budget. Here's as many people as you need. Here's as many resources as you need. Now there's no constraints. In an unconstrained world, what would you do? What would you change? And of course, some people will say, well, if I had a magic wand, I wouldn't work here. I'd work somewhere else. And that's fine. Maybe that's an important lesson to learn, that the person doing the job doesn't find this to be their end game. But I like to take this question and listen to what constraints people want to get rid of. Often the employee doing the task has learned to do the task in a constrained way, but they never balloon out to look at things that can be changed. It's like the famous story about people who are, trying to improve their skills in chopping down trees in the forest, and they want to measure the productivity by how many trees do you chop down per day. And so they're sharpening the saw, sharpening the saw, and they're counting and measuring and counting and measuring and counting and measuring, and everybody is totally optimized and focused on the trees and the tree chopping, that no one ever takes a look outside and goes and says, hey, wait a sec, we're chopping down the wrong forest, right? You can't see the forest for the trees. You're so busy optimizing, improving how you chop down trees, that you don't take a look at saying, hey, wait a sec, we're in the wrong forest. We should be in the forest down the hill or something like that. So what I like to do is encourage people to talk about things that are outside of their control. Maybe they don't like interacting with people from the sales department. Maybe they basically are fed up with having to write a lot of documentation. So this whole notion is, if I had a magic wand, I can change the constraints around my project. Now, it's very important when I'm done with the task analysis that I take the time to thank the delegate for their time. I will usually take the texts from my audio recordings, have them professionally transcribed, and I will go through those and I will identify explicitly the objects, actions, and decisions. And once I've done that, I will ask the permission of the interviewee if they can review it for me. And when they're reviewing the final artifacts, they may notice things that they misspoke or were misquoted on accidentally. They may also have remembered or recalled a step of the story that was omitted, or they might recall some object that they used that wasn't there, or some action that was taken that wasn't there. So I like to give people a chance to review and comment on it. I don't usually say I want your official approval or blessing of it, because these documents are not used for the individual. I'm not using these to judge the individual. I'm using them to learn about how the job is done, how the project is done. So I'm analyzing the task not to judge the individual, but to learn how the job is done, to develop training so that I can teach other people to do work like this in the future,
to understand the requirements from people. I want people to know that we're appreciative of their time, and we value their time and we respect them. So we're going to take time to thank people and also spread a little bit of goodwill, because it's very rare that you're only doing task analysis interviews with one person. You very often are going to be interviewing several people from this organization. So you want to sort of have this goodwill thing. Make sure you leave contact information so they can email you just in case they want to get in touch with you again in the future. We usually will show them the artifacts that we have saved. We'll show them our mind map. We'll show them the storyboard. We'll show them the lists we have. We'll have asked explicitly for copies of documents, which they'll follow up with. And we wrap up. That's it. We wrap up, we thank them, and we move on to the next task analysis. I try to schedule each task analysis meeting at about 45 minutes. I try not to have two back-to-back, but if I do, I'd like to have at least 15 minutes between meetings so that I can breathe a little bit. But it's important to grab the artifacts, label them in such a way that you can associate them with the actual interviews that you've just communicated. If you're meeting many people, it's very easy to accidentally mix up the artifacts and the questions or conflate them. And so that's it. So have a very good rest of the day. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Ciao.